Well, the Colorado Avalanche are fresh off the franchise's third Stanley Cup, tying a bow on what was a memorable 21-22 NHL season, and a good one here in Edmonton, but an important offseason lies ahead, beginning with the 2022 NHL Draft. Tony Barr here alongside a pair of voices of the Edmonton Oilers, Jack Michaels and Bob Stauffer, welcoming you to the panel presented by Sportsnet, live at another beautiful show home in the community of Hawks Ridge. It's a brand new model, the Cyrus, 2,600 square feet, a beautifully designed living space, including 5 bedrooms and 4 baths, an incredible executive chef's kitchen. You can tour the home yourself or take the virtual tour. Trust me, you'll want to check it out. It has a stunning custom wine bar. Coventry Homes, the preferred builder of the Edmonton Oilers and the 2022 Builder of the Year. All right, 2022 NHL Draft right around the corner, Jack, in Montreal. The Oilers slated to pick at number 29. They haven't selected that late since 2005 when they drafted now Stanley Cup champion Andrew Cogliano. But we do suspect that pick might be in play here for general manager Ken Holland.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a couple things. You mentioned off the top, we're just off the kitchen, and you're talking about Coventry Builder of the Year. I think Colorado and Edmonton are building toward potentially future series, and the Avalanche, I think, somewhat fitting that the best postseason run since the 1988 Edmonton Oilers, who went 16-2, the Avalanche going 16-4. There's a late pick certainly to be in play, but there's also a late pick where potentially Edmonton steps up and take it. I think all options are available to the Oilers at the draft. I think if they feel just as comfortable maybe trading back into the early stages of the second round, there might be a cluster of players maybe in that 25 to 40 range that they're potentially happy with. It might enable them to add a mid-round draft pick this year. But then again, this is a club that's landed a couple of number 22 picks, Jordan Eberle and Kyler Yamamoto. And certainly if you could find similar production at 29, then obviously you're going to step up and take the pick. As you mentioned, Tony, I think when you're going into the draft with that kind of late first-round pick, there are more than a few options on the table. And with the Oilers not selecting again until the 5th round, Bob, I think it's fair to say there could be an option that would add to the volume of picks at this year's draft.
That could happen, Jack. I think we're looking at a situation where the next 15 to 17 days in Edmonton, and I don't mean to sound like, it's The Bachelor and it's the most dramatic rose ceremony of all time. I think that this has a chance to be the most dynamic window for an Oilers offseason in a number of years. I think that there's some different variables in play. I think that there's going to be some more creative approaches to try to find a way to retain certain players, but also to potentially create some more cap flexibility as well, and including perhaps going down the path of a couple different mechanisms to ensure that that's going to happen. I'm going to assume that Ken Holland has been incredibly busy on the phone already. And I guess what I'm saying to you is I'm not sure what's going to happen at the draft, and I'm not sure something's not going to happen before the actual draft gets underway. I could foresee movement involving potentially as many as 3 to 5 players out from the team that finished in the playoff series against Colorado. This was a real good year for Edmonton. You went 3 rounds, but you still need to improve if you want to take another step. And there are, as it stands right now, the current configuration with the cap, limited cap flexibility. So it's incumbent upon a progressive organization to exhaust all mechanisms to create some more cap space. And so to me, as much as I'm kind of intrigued by the draft, I'm really more intrigued to see what kind of machinations occur before the draft, at the draft, and then after the draft heading into free agency.
And to follow up on Bob's point, Tony, already a couple of contenders in the Western Conference that I think are right there with Edmonton in terms of potential challengers have made moves. Minnesota moved out Kevin Fiala, and LA went all in on a player coming off a career year. So as Bob mentioned, this has the potential not only to be interesting for Edmonton, but there's a cluster of Western Conference challengers that I believe feel, along with Edmonton, are right there. And one of those teams extended St. Louis extended Colorado to 6 games. I think those are the teams that Bob are talking about where there could be a bit of an arms race in the next 2.5 to 3 weeks. And as Bob indicates, Edmonton's not the only challenger at the table. And there might be some, form of pressure to kind of keep up with the Joneses a little bit, because I think a lot of teams feel like Colorado was built to win this year. The Avalanche are not going to look the same next season. And as a result, if they come back a little bit, that cluster of challengers with the right moves has an opportunity to get a leg up.
Tony, what's interesting, Jack mentions Kevin Fiala, and there's a player by the name of Evander Kane. So if you're Dan Milstein and you're seeing what Fiala just got at 7.75 times 8 in a max term length deal, you're saying, hey, what about my guy? Like, my guy roared into Edmonton, and he was pretty good for the Oilers.
Greater and longer body of work, too.
Right, and frankly, a way better playoff performer than Fiala has been to this point. So there's a factor there. We need to get a resolution here to Mike Smith and Duncan Keith. And even with Duncan Keith, you have to ask yourself, do you go down the Brooks Orpik train from a few years ago where you trade and potentially look at bringing him back? I mean, is that at all feasible? Or do you just have, a scenario where Duncan Keith's coming back? We're not sure as of right now what's going to happen with Mike Smith and Duncan Keith. We know there was a June 30th ask date on that front. Then you have the situation with Evander Kane. What's going on? I think, is there a way you could circumvent requiring an arbitrator? Can you get a deal done before you actually have that decision needed to take place? And then you have some other contracts you might theoretically have to move out if you do indeed end up keeping or finding a way to have Evander Kane. And that doesn't even bring us to Brett Kulak, who I do think there's a concerted effort right now going on to start the process again and re-sign. There is a lot that's going to take place over the next 15 days.
And that's why the draft is so interesting, Tony, because Edmonton is right now managing short-term and long-term goals, because the Oilers, to some degree, are also entering that win-now window. I mean, there's no longer the thought, well, this team is going to be ready 2 to 3 years down the road. And that's why what's interesting, Tony, is do you fill out some of those middle rounds that are vacant this year because of the acquisitions of Kulikov, Keith, and Kulak, or do you continue to maybe hollow out the draft a little bit and maybe move up or acquire players that might enable to help you win in the next 1 to 3 years? So it's very interesting, the different strategies at play when you mention the draft, not only this year, but also next year.
And the Oilers' top 2 players, Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, 25 and 26 years old, conceivably in their prime right now. So definitely in win-now mode. All right, Jack, Bob mentioned all of the pressing things with the forwards, the defense, but is Ken Holland's main priority, now don't get me wrong, the other ones are still important, is the main priority to figure out the man between the pipes?
Well, I think part of it depends on where you feel Stuart Skinner is at. Very strong regular season, showed what he could do in spot duty in the National Hockey League. But I mentioned spot duty. There is a difference between spot duty in the National Hockey League and going into a year where you're expected to start 30 games. If Mike Smith is the guy, and we don't even know that right now, and even if Mike Smith is not the guy, my hunch, Bob, and maybe he would have a differing opinion, but my hunch is the guy you're going to bring in is probably not going to be a Cam Talbot type going back to 2017, who you're going to play 70 games. My hunch is if it's Stuart Skinner that you're looking at as the number 2, he's going to play 30 games, because I think the guy you're bringing in is probably more of a 50 to 55 game starter. And there's more candidates for that than there would be to be a guy to be the workhorse, to be the unquestioned number 1. I just feel like the way the market looks right now, that would be my best guess. But as Bob said, right now may change in a big way by the time we get to the draft.
Yeah, what's true today might not be true tomorrow. That's just the reality of the situation. Literally in this situation, because of sort of the wanting to get some sort of indication from both Duncan Keith on the back end as well as Mike Smith in goal. And since we're talking about goal, I mean, here's where I mentioned to you that in the cap system, going back to 05-06 when Sherwood Park's Cam Ward vanquished the Oilers in Game 7, every team that's won the Stanley Cup, with the exception of this year, has won the cup with a goaltender they either drafted or they developed. Like, you can sit there and look at in back-to-back years, Niemi in 2010 and Tim Thomas in 2011. They weren't drafted by Chicago and Boston, but they were brought into their organizations through their minor league teams.
And developed.
Right. And, I thought, well, wasn't Hasek the goalie in 08 in Detroit? Actually, the goalie was Osgood. He came back for his second tour duty. He was a Detroit drafted and developed goaltender. So Darcy Kemper was the first one that wasn't drafted and developed by Colorado. And I also think that speaks to Colorado, how good they were, that he was just okay. That said, he's going to be a guy out there. If he ends up in the UFA market, there's going to be lots of teams in on him. I'm with Jack totally. I look at Stuart Skinner and think, I do think he can get to the point where he's a 50 to 55 game a year starter. And I also think in the Western Conference, that's as many starts as you want. I think you kill your goalies if you start them in 70 games. I don't think you can do that today in the NHL. So I think you want to grow and progress Stuart Skinner. So either Mike Smith comes back and is up for the challenge in terms of the games played, or they got to go out and get another guy that can play that volume of 45 to 55 games in a season.
By the way, the goaltender that Bob Stauffer was obviously alluding to, Darcy Kemper, who was traded for a first-round pick. As for Edmonton's first-round pick, we'll see what they do come next week in Montreal at the 2022 NHL Draft.